Hi. Thank you. So this evening we're streaming again on YouTube, and I think it went well yesterday. I think it seemed to have everything seemed to work fine. So today we'll go through the again our usual agenda. We'll start with the chief with his comments, then Joyce Woolhether, the ratification officer. Then we'll switch over to David Knoll, who will talk about the TLE settlement agreement. Then Stephen Pillipow, who will be talking about the proposed legacy trust agreement. And then finally, Louis Tapper, who will be giving some financial, he's a financial advisor, and he'll be talking about the projections for the new trust. So if we can, Chief.
Thank you, Roger. Take my mask off. First of all, I'd like to welcome the Mistawasis First Nation Nahiwak members to our informational session as it relates to our tree land entitlement offer. I'd like to thank Happy Samuel there for his opening prayer to get the meeting off in a good way. Over the past number of years, Mistawasis has been working very, very diligently on your behalf. As far back as probably the turn of the century, almost 20 years, we've been dealing with this outstanding tree land entitlement claim for the nation. Now today we're in a position to offer, I guess, the membership the considerations of an offer. Initially, when we began the process years ago, it was under the 1994 Tree Land Entitlement Framework Agreement. Back in those days, the framework agreement was led by, I think, 25 First Nations here in the province of Saskatchewan that basically begin to understand that when the treaty was signed back in 1876, data first survey, which was 1878, when the reserve was first determined the size and composition of the nation based on our population base. So as a result of that, the Tree Land Entitlement Framework came into existence because a lot of First Nations felt that they were shortchanged, their membership weren't counted in when their original reserve was determined. So in our case, Mistawasis didn't really finalize our TLE till probably the latter part of 1990s, and then early in the 2000s, we began to really seriously look at our claim. Thanks to one of our band members, Mr. Johnson Lawrence, very, very innovative in the way that he took the approach, and so this is where we are today with an offer. Like I mentioned, the process began in 1994. Mistawasis process began probably 20 years ago. The initial offers were based on the 92 framework, which was at $224 an acre. So it didn't amount to very much. I think the first offer was a little over $3 million, and then it went up to, I think, $5.some million based on that framework and the price per acre, which was $424 an acre. So as a result of that, Mistawasis, one of our former chiefs, the late Cecil Head, was very instrumental in bringing together what he referred to as a common table. A common table was the result of 3 or 4 First Nations coming together: Mistawasis, Achakakoop, Sakame, and later Joseph Bighead. Bighead came into the picture as well. So as of today, there was 4 First Nations that collectively came together to work together to get the real amount that they were looking for. When I say the real amount, it was the adjusted price per acre, because when we continued on with the negotiation efforts, that was probably our biggest obstacle, was getting to address the whole notion of adjusted price per acre. Like I mentioned, it came in at $424 an acre, and then I think in 2011, Minister Chevrolet of the province of Saskatchewan recommended an increase to $424 an acre, which ultimately wasn't accepted by the federal government, so as was sufficient for us to bring to the membership. So as a result of those discussions and negotiations, the adjusted price per acre reflected the average price over 3 years. I think it was 16, 17, and 18. So out of those 3 years, we took an average price of undeveloped acre, which was anywhere from $1,000 to $2,500 an acre. So as a result of that, we were able to come in at $1,026 per acre, a significant jump from the initial framework. So as a result of that, Canada, the province of Saskatchewan, and Mistawasis Nahiwak community agreed that the offer of $30 million, would would be something that we would support. So as a result of that, we began the process of looking at ways and means of how to put this all together. Given the fact that we have an existing specific claim trust that has the same responsibility as the TLE process of $14 million and $30 million that will go into that same pool of money. So that rationale is based on cost savings for the nation. If we went ahead and continued and established two separate trusts, two separate entities that had the same responsibility, the cost of administering our existing specific claim trust is around $300,000 to $400,000 annually. So I'm making the assumption that the TLE would be probably similar in nature with expenses. So as a result of that, instead of having one independent trust that has the same responsibilities to buy our land and invest it, it made more economic sense for the nation to consider the ability for us to amend the specific claim trust agreement and put the money in there. So as a result of that, that's what we're proposing for the membership to consider this evening. So as a result, I guess, of all the things that we've been doing on your behalf today, we are here to, I guess, formally present, the offer for Mistawasis and your consideration for the amalgamation, or I shouldn't say the amalgamation, but the amendment of the specific claim trust agreement to allow for the transfer of the specific TLE funds to go into our new legacy trust. So moving forward, I know we've identified opportunities, I guess, with respect to how this is going to be a little more easier to administer, I guess. First of all, the cost-saving mechanisms is a no-brainer. Secondly, the ability of the First Nation to have access to, I think, $750,000 beginning in 2000, us and them kind of mentality, and shouldn't have been like that. So with that in mind, we thought that there has to be a more effective and easier way to look at community development in that respect. So on your behalf, we included an amendment that would look at the band receiving $750,000 beginning in 2023 moving forward. After we acquire all the lands, I think 35,000 acres with the equity acre, and the balance of whatever's left in the specific claim trust agreement, I think 9,000 acres or 4,000 acres. Once all those acres have been realized and bought, then the trust would go to 4% for membership support. When I say membership support, that $750,000 would go to the 4% of that. So as a result, there'll be more resources available to the nation to invest back in the community for playgrounds, for housing, for development, for educational opportunities. It could go on forever. It could be, opportunities for the urban members to look at, maybe housing opportunities or other considerations. But again, when it's all said and done, the membership support act will have to work, and figure out ways and means of how to work collectively for all our people, regardless of where they reside. So I thank you all for coming out tonight. We have a number of individuals here. We have David Knoll, one of our lawyers that dealt specifically with the settlement agreement. We have Stephen Pillipow that dealt specifically with the trust agreement, and Louis Tapper, the financial advisor, that would give you a financial explanation of the benefits of moving in this direction as a First Nation. So with that, thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? I would like to thank the elder for the prayer. So as Roger mentioned, my name is Joyce Woolhether. I work for Indigenous Services Canada, and I have been appointed as your ratification officer for the Treaty Land Entitlement Settlement Agreement vote. Has been omitted from the list, incorrectly listed, or that a person not qualified to vote has been included on the list, you can advise the membership clerk or myself, and we will follow up on amending the voters list if required. There are two methods of voting. You may vote in person at the poll on the day of the vote, or you may vote by mail-in ballot, but you can only vote once. The poll will be held in the Chief Mistawasis School Gym on November the 10th, 2021, from 9 in the morning until 8 p.m. Information packages along with the mail-in ballot package have been mailed to all voters whose addresses were provided. Robin Daniels, Colby Daniels, Stephen Johnston, Derek Sanderson, Leslie said either drop it off or you can vote today in person. So all ballots must be received by myself no later than the close of the poll, which is 8 p.m. on November the 10th, 2021. Any ballots received after that time will not be counted. The vote is conducted by secret ballot. You cannot vote by proxy, which means someone else cannot vote for you. If you receive a ballot that is improperly printed, stained, or you mismarked your ballot, you can request a new ballot from either myself or one of the deputies. The original ballot will be marked void and will not be counted. You can ask for assistance in completing the ballot envelope, or if you need help to do the ballot. The ballots will be counted after the poll closes. The count can be viewed by any member of the First Nation and will be held in the Chief Mistawasis School gym. COVID measures will be in place. I will open the ballot box, inspect the ballots, and each ballot, other than those rejected or voided, will be shown to those in attendance. Voided ballots are not opened or counted, and rejected ballots cannot be shown as the voter may have identified themselves. A ballot will be considered rejected if the intent of the voter is not clear, so you've marked both the yes and no box, or the voter has identified themselves either by initials or written the name on the ballot. A number of individuals will have tally sheets to ensure the count is accurate. A large tally sheet will be placed on the wall so everyone in attendance will be able to see how the count is proceeding. To consider this a yes vote, 50% plus one of all eligible voters that appear on the voters list must vote yes. There are approximately 2,100 eligible voters' names on the list, so we would need 1,051 voters to vote yes in order for this vote to be successful. The total number of eligible voters may change, accompanied by a declaration containing the grounds for requesting the review and any other relevant information, and be signed in the presence of a witness who is at least 18 years of age. So I will be accepting ballots tonight in the completed declaration envelope. If you didn't bring your ballot, I do have extra ballots with me. And if you require assistance, just let us know. Does anybody have any questions? All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joyce. So next up will be David Knoll, and he'll be doing, where are we? There we are. And he'll be doing a presentation on tree land entitlement settlement agreement. Go, David.
Yeah. Good evening. My name's David Knoll. I'm legal counsel, and I've been working with the First Nation on the settlement of this treaty land entitlement claim since 2005, trying to negotiate a settlement with Canada. You should have received in your package, if you have received a package, a summary, an executive summary of the settlement agreement, as well as a more detailed summary of the agreement. I'm just going to be presenting today a PowerPoint presentation, which is even more of a summary of the agreement, answering any questions that you may have. By way of background to this claim, because some of you might be wondering what's this claim all about that we're settling for millions of dollars. Back in the 70s, there was one of the First Nations in Saskatchewan that checked surveyed their reserve and checked it against the treaty, their treaty, and they found out, hey, we didn't receive all the land that we should have received under the treaty. So they went to the FSIN. The FSIN said, well, we'll conduct some research and we'll find out if you were shortchanged. You didn't get all the land that you were entitled to. That research was conducted in the 70s. The research was completed, and the researchers identified for the First Nation that there were actually 25 First Nations that didn't receive all the land that they were entitled to under Treaty 4, 6, 8, or 10. So they emphasized and said, well, what are we going to do about this? We've got to get this settled. And they approached Canada and they said, we've got an issue here. Not enough land has been provided for these 25, and it turned out to be 26 First Nations. And Canada said, yes, we're prepared to settle. They accepted that there was a shortfall, that these 26 were entitled to. They said, well, how do we settle it? They came up with a formula in '76 to settle it, and they agreed with Saskatchewan that this was the approach they were going to take. The only problem was that Saskatchewan said, before we transfer any land over to Canada to fulfill the treaty land entitlement obligation under the Natural Resources Transfer Agreement, we want to make sure all these third-party issues are dealt with first. How you deal with roads, how you deal with water, how you deal with all these other third-party issues. So this whole '76 approach got bogged down, and we actually ended up in court over that issue. But in the 1980s, while we were going through this court action, Canada said, hey, let's put a pause to this thing and see if we can't resolve this in another way, not necessarily the '76 formula, but a different approach. So they set up a commission to investigate this, and the commission came up with a report in the late 80s, which said equity formula. So we went to the Assembly of Entitlement Chiefs, the 26 First Nations, the chiefs and councils, and we said, are you prepared to proceed under this new formula, this new arrangement? Under that arrangement, the First Nations were going to receive the money, and then they would assume the obligation of dealing with all these third-party issues. They agreed that that would be the approach. The province agreed that that would be an acceptable approach, and so did Canada. So in 1992, there was a settlement agreement called the 1992 Claim Settlement, TLE Settlement Agreement for the 26 First Nations. And since then, that is a framework on which other First Nations, another 8 First Nations, settled their claims as well. Now, under this arrangement, Canada agreed to provide them enough money for those 26 First Nations to acquire land with reserve status. And they use that money then to acquire the land and also deal with all these third-party issues. The payment of this money was over a 12-year period in installments. That was the amount of the settlement came to $500 million was paid over to these First Nations over a 12-year period to acquire up to 1.6 million acres of entitlement reserve land in Saskatchewan. And this, like I said, this 1992 framework agreement set the template or precedent for how other TLE First Nations in Saskatchewan agreed to settle their TLE claims as well. In 2005, the Mistawasis First Nation submitted a claim to Canada under the specific claims policy. Lawrence was the one, Johnston was the one that said, hey, we may, under this new approach, the equity formula, we may be shortchanged land as well. So under that submission, the claim stated that in 1878... Huh?
Can I make that full screen quick so people can read it easier?
Okay, sure.
Sorry.
He's going to make it bigger so you can...
It's a little easier.
Is that better? So the basis of the claim is that 1878, a reserve of 49,280 acres was surveyed for the First Nation, whereas 53,632 acres should have been set aside as a reserve. In other words, the First Nation was shortchanged 4,352 acres. So Based on the equity formula, Canada went back and made an offer in March of 2019, a global settlement offer in the amount of $31,576,975, and this included $1.2 million dollars to cover land acquisition, ratification, negotiation, and some additional costs. Saskatchewan's portion, they agreed to share at 70-30. Saskatchewan would settle and make its payment in the amount of $9,106,280. Canada's portion of the settlement was $22,470,695. The First Nation accepted the offer and agreed to proceed to negotiate a settlement under the principles of the Saskatchewan 1992 TLE Framework Agreement. Now, one thing that the chief mentioned, which is true, originally there was a 12-year payout period. Some of the other TLE First Nations that negotiated settlement later had a payout over a 5-year period. And the amount per acre originally was $262 per acre. Canada increased it later to $424 some dollars per acre, and at the end of the day, they agreed to agree on an amount per acre of over $1,000 per acre. So those are the calculations that went into the 31 million plus settlement offer that was made. So there is a shortfall acres of 4,352. Now Canada has said, before you use any of the money that's in this legacy trust, this money's going into this legacy trust, you have to get this 4,352 acres first. Surface and subsurface. That means the minerals underneath, and you have to deal with all the third-party issues. So number one, here's 31 million. It's going into the legacy trust. First, you have to acquire that 4,352 acres. Surface, subsurface, and deal with all the third-party issues and get it transferred into reserve status. After that, if there's any money left over, you can use the balance of the money for band development or to acquire some additional reserve land up to 29,394.18 acres. And what I have there under compensation is sort of a breakdown of what the amount of money is that was paid, that will be paid into the trust account and for what purposes. So Canada said once this is ratified by Canada, in other words, first the First Nation ratifies it, Saskatchewan then ratifies this agreement, then it goes to Canada and they ratify the agreement. Once it's ratified by Canada, they said within 45 days they will transfer into that legacy trust, the First Nations legacy trust, their portion of the settlement first. Saskatchewan, after Canada ratifies the agreement, Canada will transfer its portion to Saskatchewan will transfer its portion to Canada and within 45 days, and Canada will then transfer Saskatchewan's portion into the trust account within 45 days after that. There are schedules attached to this agreement. You might have noticed if you got the package. There's a schedule called Mineral Revenue Sources. This identifies all the subsurface minerals. If you're going out to purchase minerals, and there are people that own the minerals or lease the minerals, these are the type of mineral revenues and mineral sources that you would have to deal with. Now, I want to make it clear that if no one owns the minerals, it's not leased, and you're going to try and acquire the minerals, and they're what they call undisposed of minerals, you get them for free. It's only if the minerals are owned or leased to somebody that you have to deal with the minerals. Otherwise, you get the minerals for free. Schedule 2 deals with amendments to the Natural Resources Transfer Agreement. Because Canada is receiving from the province not land but monies to settle TLE, there has to be an amendment to the Natural Resources Transfer Agreement. The ratification vote guidelines and procedures have already been discussed earlier today. I have to provide a certificate of independent legal advice that I had a meeting like this. I explained the settlement agreement and answered any questions you may have. Stephen will also have to sign a certificate of independent legal advice on the trust agreement that he's going to be explaining to you next. And then Louis has to sign a certificate of independent financial advice based on the information he's going to share with you after Stephen. Schedule 6 is the terms and conditions of reserve creation. This outlines, once you purchase the land, say from a farmer, well, how do you get it from fee simple land from the farmer over into reserve status? And the entitlement reserve creation schedule lays out all the steps you have to follow, and I'll be discussing that a little bit further. There's an appendix also dealing with public utility easements. For example, if you buy land and there's a SaskTel power line or TransGas power line through the land, these are the type of easements you have to enter into. I sort of covered this already. They agreed, Canada and Saskatchewan agreed to cost share this thing on a 70-30 basis. You have to get the shortfall acres first. There are provisions in this agreement that makes it clear that the capital, that 30 million that's going to be deposited into your legacy trust, that will not be taxed, subject to tax. It doesn't affect any other program funding, this agreement. It doesn't prejudice the First Nations' right to determine its own membership. And if in the future there's some constitutional amendment, there hasn't been any so far, but if there is a constitutional amendment that you might benefit from, this agreement can be amended to take advantage of that benefit. Okay, now, if you're going out to purchase land, whoever it is from the trust or whoever's assigned to acquire land to fulfill, first of all, the shortfall acres, you have to acquire the land, and you're looking at acquiring the land, minerals, and improvements. You're dealing with the farmer or the Canada, if they own the land, or you're dealing with the province if they own Crown land. It's on a willing seller, willing buyer. In other words, you're negotiating with them for the purchase of that interest in the land or the minerals. And so it's a deal that you're negotiating with, and you come to some sort of an agreement. Now, there's an understanding that the money, first of all, has to, like I said, be used to get those shortfall acres, those 4,000 acres. So you can't use up all the trust money to go to, say, Saskatoon or Prince Albert here and spend all the money to buy a few acres of urban reserve land. You have no money left to get that shortfall acres. So there's an upper limit on what you can spend to buy the land until you get those shortfall acres first. All the land that you get or acquire for settlement has to be in Saskatchewan. You can't go to Manitoba or Alberta and acquire land there for TLE purposes. So if you're going to get the land, once you make a deal on a willing seller, willing buyer, and you have a deal with a farmer, you have to first of all make sure that you do all the title searches to find out who all the third parties are that you may have to deal with in purchasing the land. Then you pass a BCR saying that you want to purchase that parcel of land and you want to transfer it to reserve status. You give it to the Department of Indian Affairs, the regional offices. They register it, and they then tell the province that the First Nation wants to acquire this parcel of land and transfer it to reserve status. The BCR is then registered. The First Nation will have someone from the regional offices of the Department of Indian Affairs assigned who will prepare a submission to make sure all these issues are dealt with before the land is transferred to reserve status. Once that submission is complete and everything seems okay, it goes to what they call a committee, additions to reserve committee. They look at the submission and they make a decision whether to recommend that this land be purchased and transferred to reserve status, or they may conditionally recommend it. In other words, they may say, hey, there's some issues that still need to be resolved before we transfer to reserve status. Now, minerals are sometimes the toughest thing to get, subsurface minerals, unless they're undisposed of. In other words, no one else owns them or it's not leased. So when you're going to purchase land and subsurface minerals, you have to make sure that whoever the mineral owner is or leaseholder, they have access to this land. And so there's some sort of access arrangements that you have to be concerned about. Since there's a difference between those that own the minerals and those that have a right to use the minerals, there are provisions in the agreement how you deal with these separate interests in the minerals. Now, you may be looking at a parcel of land. A farmer has a pond, say, on this land. Now, the pond, if it's wholly enclosed within the land that you're looking at purchasing, you get the pond, you get the water, you get the beds of the water and everything. But if it's a creek that passes through the land, or it's adjacent to the land, there's a river adjacent to the land, then you can acquire up a certain portion of it, what they call it, the ordinary high water mark. You can, if you have an interest in acquiring that amount of land. But the beds and the shores of that water body up to the high water mark, you can purchase that. As far as the rest of the creek or the river, the First Nation would have a right to make sure, what's called riparian rights, to make sure the quantity of water stays the same. In other words, it's not polluted. If there's a project up above the water or below the water that causes the water to be polluted, you have an opportunity to take some action against them. Or you may even be able to participate in whatever that water project is, if they're talking about a project that's going to be set up that's going to affect the water that might be passing through the land that you're interested in purchasing. I haven't seen any of those arrangements yet by any of the TLE bands in Saskatchewan, but there is a provision there that enables you to do that. Now, there may be a road. What if there's a road across there? A paved road will normally not be transferred over to the First Nation to be transferred into a reserve. If there's an undeveloped road, like a gravel road that passes through the land, you have the ability to acquire that. But on the understanding that if in the province wants that road back because they want to develop that road for public, I think it's a 20-year, 25-year fund that's set aside to compensate them for any revenue, tax revenue that they lose because of an entitlement reserve. Now, there are certain third-party issues like mortgages, tax liens, writs of execution, and all this sort of stuff that might be on the land. You might have to deal with those as well. The Mistawasis actually has a land code. So that land code might be applicable for dealing with some of these third-party issues. Or there is also a First Nations piece of legislation under the Indian Act dealing with lands on reserve and Reserve Creation Act, which might make acquiring and dealing with these third-party issues quicker, more efficiently. So you may have a choice of, do we go under the code or do we take advantage of the Indian Act provisions, whichever is better and whichever is cheaper. Dune, Regina, these First Nations that have acquired urban property, they have these type of service agreements that they've negotiated with the urban municipality to avoid any conflicts or inconsistency. There is a provision that Canada can go ahead and actually set aside some of these urban reserves, even though the municipality doesn't agree with the service agreement. But the municipality can always appeal and say, we acted in good faith and there's no reason why Canada should proceed without our approval. And then the First Nation and the municipality have to continue to negotiate and see if they can come up with an acceptable service agreement. At the end of the day, because of this agreement, Canada wants to be released from any further treaty land entitlement obligation. It's not a release from any other claims the First Nation has, it's only treaty land entitlement obligations. In other words, they don't want 15 years from now for the First Nation to come back and say, hey, our population has grown and we need more TLE land. This is a full and final settlement of the TLE obligation that Canada has, and they want to be released from that TLE obligation. Saskatchewan wants to be released from its obligations under the Natural Resources Transfer Agreement to transfer TLE land for TLE purposes to Canada, so that they both want to be released from this obligation. And they want to make sure that there will be no future action against either of them for a TLE claim. It doesn't affect any of the other treaty rights you have, and if in fact your Treaty 6 is amended, that gives you the opportunity to acquire more land because of a population increase, for example. If the treaty is amended, then you can take advantage of those, and this agreement can be amended. There are provisions also in this agreement for a settlement board or arbitration to deal with any disputes or disagreements. I don't know of any TLE trust. That's not taxable. There's no GST paid for the purchase of land, minerals, or improvements. There's also no GST applicable to the acquisition costs related to the purchase of land, minerals, or improvements. So, and also there's no fees that can be charged to the public utilities that may be crossing the land based on the easement agreements that you have. So the only thing I want to say about this is the settlement at ratification and approval. You have to get an approval by 50% plus one of the members saying yes to this agreement. Not just the agreement, but the trust agreement, which Stephen will be talking about after me. Now, if there isn't a majority that approves this, there is an opportunity for a second vote, but that's only after there's consultation with Canada to figure out, well, what went wrong the first time? And there may need to be some amendments to the trust agreement or whatever. I can't think of any amendments that Canada would agree to the settlement agreement, but there may be some adjustments made to the trust agreement. So that's my submission. Are there any questions that you have about just the settlement agreement? Yes, sir.
The amendments you're talking about,
Yeah.
okay, is that, and you mentioned trust agreement, is that the specific land claim trust or the TLE?
Well, that's something you'll have to talk to Steve. I'm talking about amendments to the settlement agreement, not the trust agreement. The settlement agreement, probably there isn't going to be much amendments to that because this has been a precedent since 1992. But the trust agreement, there may be, if it's not approved the first time, there may be amendments to it. And you can talk with Stephen about that. Yeah.
Because I know I sat on the first trust,
Okay.
land claims trust, and
The specific claims trust. Yeah, yeah.
I'd like to see where it can be amended.
Okay. Well, I leave that to Stephen to talk to that, because I haven't even seen the trust agreement. I haven't seen the first one or the second one, so specific claims are the TLE. Any questions about the settlement agreement? I'm going to be around, bouncing around here if you have any questions you want to ask me directly, or you can contact me through Roger. He has my email address and telephone number. I wish you all the best in the vote, and thank you.
All right, thank you, David. Okay, I've been just reminded that If you have any questions, can you go to the mic so they're clear on the online presentation? Okay, next up will be Stephen Pillipow, and he will be speaking on the proposed legacy trust agreement.
Okay. Evening, everybody, and Elder, thanks for the prayer. And I'm going to answer your question right now. I'm not going to wait. The specific claim trust agreement in section 21.03 allows the agreement to be amended with the members' approval through a ratification vote. Okay? So what is happening is allowed under the agreement. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing this. Okay? It's right now. This is it. Okay. So what you're doing is you're voting on two things. You're voting on the settlement agreement that David just talked about, and you're voting on the amendment of the specific claim trust. So it's one package. It's yes or no to both. Okay. So when you look at the ballot question, there's actually three questions. Okay. Question one, do you agree to the terms of the TLE settlement agreement? Question two, do you agree to the amendment of the Mistawasis Specific Claim Trust? And question three, do you authorize the Chief and Council and the trustees to do whatever is necessary to give effect to, sign the agreements and give effect to the what needs to be done? Okay, so it's yes to all of it or it's no to all of it. So that's what's happening right now, okay? Okay, good. And questions are good because I ramble on here because I have to do this, but I like answering questions. I'd rather do that. So I know, and we're just to, before I go on, there was at one time they were talking about, and there was some discussion in the community, and there would have been some communication coming out from the First Nation, from the council, that the specific claim trust was going to be amended, going to be terminated. That's not happening. Because when we looked at it, there's no provision in the specific claim trust that allowed it to be terminated, but it does allow it to be amended. So we had to go along with the approach that's being taken. So, as David said, there's the settlement agreement, and the settlement agreement requires that the entitlement monies that David talked about be deposited into a trust account in accordance with the terms of a trust agreement that meets the requirements of the settlement agreement. And what that generally means is that until the shortfall acres have been purchased and set apart as a reserve, being the shortfall acres acquisition date, the entitlement monies can only be used to purchase those shortfall acres, that 4,352 acres. After that is accomplished, the shortfall acres date, the entitlement monies can be used to purchase more land up to the equity quantum, the 29,394.18, and for band development. And that term band development is defined in the settlement agreement, and therefore it becomes the same definition that is going to be put into the trust agreement as part of the amendments, because we have to comply with the settlement agreement. So what we're proposing to accomplish that is to amend the Mistawasis Specific Claim Trust. The proposed amendments, there's lots of them, there's no doubt when you look at it, which it's going to become known as the Mistawasis Legacy Trust, as the Chief is talking about. It's not a new trust. It's still the same trust, it's just an amended version of it, but it's going to be renamed to the Mistawasis Legacy Trust. Now, the amendments are doing a couple of things. The first thing they're going to do is make sure we comply with the terms of the settlement agreement. So the specific claim trust property will remain in the trust. There's about 14,600,000. It's probably a little bit more than that now. This is going back to the beginning of July when we had that number, when we were preparing these documents. And they've also purchased and are sitting in, they're waiting to go into reserve status, 4,606 acres. Those acres will actually be used to fulfill your shortfall acres. which is a good thing because you'll get it almost immediately. As soon as Roger can get through the reserve creation process and get him into reserve status, and there you go, then you fulfilled that requirement. And then the entitlement monies, that $30,596,765 will be contributed into the trust. Canada will deposit directly into the trust account on the First Nations' behalf, and that will be included as part of the trust property. Now, David went through this about the entitlement monies, and I just wanted to put it up there because I just wanted to highlight the additional costs for you, that $142,500, because I'm going to talk about that in a little while here, and I just wanted to make sure that you knew where that $142,500 was coming from and why it is going to be coming out of the trust almost immediately, and we'll get to there. So, when we first sat down with, and I was asked to come to the meeting with the trustees, the chief and council, and the people on the committee, and we were going to talk about this, the trust agreement. There were some options, and we talked about the options that Mistawasis had. They could have just left the specific claim trust the way it was, and it would continue to operate the way it was, and could have developed a new trust, Mistawasis TLE trust, to take these entitlement monies and then operate them. So you could have had two trusts, and that was something that could have happened. But then we started looking at it and say, well, why don't we just have one trust? And we started looking at it in a little bit more detail, and when we finally looked at it, we said, well, the benefits to having one trust severely outweigh anything that you would get in having two trusts. So the decision was made to go with one trust and to work towards getting that done. And the benefits, and I know I was asked a question at one of the information meetings, well, what are the negatives? And I don't see any negatives to doing this. All I do see is positives. The biggest one is the cost savings, and the chief kind of talked about that already in his comments. There's going to, when you have two trusts, there's going to be more cost to operate those two trusts. Now, Louis Tapper sat down because he's more familiar with the operation of the specific claim trust through his work with the audits, and he estimated that it would be about a savings of $150,000 per year to have one trust as opposed to two. So that's how much more you would have spent, and it could be more, it could be less, but he thought it would be about $150,000 annually. We took a 25-year period, so over that 25-year period, that's a total of $3,750,000 that would be saved in costs. But when you look at that over the 25-year period and you apply, investing, if you just take that $150 every year and you just invest it, at a 7% return, that comes over to about $10 million. So that's for you guys. You just saved $10 million and made $10 million by going with one trust as opposed to having two. Better returns, investment returns, and this is just coming from, my experience. 2001 is a long time ago. We've learned a lot during this last 20 years, and the one thing that we've learned is how to invest better. And it's not saying that the trustees haven't been doing a good job in the investing, but it could be done better because of certain provisions in the specific claim trust agreement, and we're suggesting that those provisions be changed just slightly, and we should be able, because of those changes, get a better rate of return. We've been told that we should be able to get a 7% rate of return on average going forward if we do these things. Right now, the specific claim trust, because some of the restrictions that are in the trust agreement, has been averaging about 5%. So it's a 2% difference. Over time, that 2% is a huge difference. If you look at 25 years with that $40 million that will be left in the trust account, that's about $25 million more to you. So just those two things just made $35 million, and that alone would have been sufficient to have gone this way as opposed to two separate trusts. But, we wanted, the trust is old, it's 20 years old, it's done its job, but it was time to update it to more current standards. So we've made some of those changes. The purchasing land, and I know when the specific claim trust was first established, it was a priority to purchase land and get that land back that was taken from the reserve, or at least that amount of land back. And that's still going to remain a priority. But when you have two trusts and you have two groups of trustees and two offices, and they're both mandated to go out and purchase land, you know, you could have some confusion, you could have some inefficiencies going on. So we thought having one group of trustees doing the land purchasing would be less confusion and more efficient. And then lastly, the distribution to the members. We're going to talk about that, and you've all heard about it, what's being proposed. If we hadn't have done this and we hadn't amended the specific claim trust, you could have still had a distribution, but it would have been far less. Under the settlement, the TLE settlement agreement, Canada would have allowed up to $1,250,000 to be used to make a distribution. Well, we're going to use $5 million to make that distribution. So you're getting, you know, 4 times the amount because of the approach that's being taken here, as opposed to having a separate trust. So to me, those are pretty big benefits to having one trust. So that's what is being, when what you're voting on is to amend the specific claim trust to accomplish all of those things. So I'm going to go through a summary of what the amendments are. As I say, there's lots of them. In fact, my computer tells me there's about 1,200 different changes with all the cross-throughs, taking words out and periods and whatnot, but it's a, you know, a fair amount of changes. So I'm just going to summarize them for you. The first thing is the structure of the trust is going to remain the same. There's going to be no difference in the structure. There's still 3 parties to the agreement: the First Nation, as represented by the council. There's still individual band members who will act as the trustees, 5 of them. The names are up there for the original. Those are the current trustees, and they'll just continue to be the trustees. We are going to change their terms, and I'll talk about that in a little while. And then the institution. Recently, the institution's been changed from CIBC to Royal Trust Corporation of Canada. So Royal Trust will act as the institution. The institution's role really is just a protector. Call it what you want, a protector, gatekeeper. Their job is to make sure the trustees are following the terms of the trust agreement before any money is dispersed out of the trust account and is only used for the purposes that is set out in the trust agreement. And they will make sure that happens, because if they don't, then they'll become liable for it. There's still 3 parts. You know, the trust arrangement, part 1. Part 2 is the banking agreement with the institution. And then part 3 is just some general provisions and amendment provisions. The name of the trust is going to change from the Mistawasis Specific Claim Trust to the Mistawasis Legacy Trust. When we first started talking about this, the chief said to me, "Stephen, can we set this up in such a way that down the road, if we settle our cows and plows claim, or we settle some other claim, can we put it into this trust?" And I said, yes, you can do that. So that's part of the changes, to make sure that moving forward, you can always put more money into this trust if you want in the future, okay? TLE settlement agreement, of course, we had a number of changes that were made to comply with the requirements of the TLE settlement agreement, so that the money could be paid into the trust account by Canada. The chief talked about this annual payment. So what is being proposed here is that annually a payment will be made to the First Nation beginning in 2023, and the chief talked about the amount for initially at $750,000 per year. That'll be for the first 4 years, and then beginning in 2027 in the 5th year, and until the full acres are purchased. And the full acres I'm going to come to in just a minute, but until all the acres have been purchased, it'll be then 2% of a rolling average 5 years of the value of the trust property. So if it's $40 million, then $2 million is about $1 million, and as it grows, hopefully the trust property is growing, then that 2% will also grow at a similar rate. After the full acres are purchased, so they get all the acres bought, then that percentage will increase to 4%, and that'll come out on an annual basis. This whole idea, as the chief talked about, is replacing the concept of specific claim development requests that are currently in the specific claim trust agreement. That whole idea is going to be removed. The First Nation could not make any more requests for funds for any specific claim developments, and there's no need any longer for a member resolution to pay that money out. There's not going to be any voting going on to allow the First Nation to take any more money out, unless, of course, there's an amendment to it. It's just automatically done by the trustees and the institution annually, and it goes into an account that the First Nation will establish, which is referred to as the Mistawasis Legacy Revenue Account. And then the First Nation, the council, will use those funds and spend it in accordance with the terms of what they're supposed to do for land development or land purchases. The full acres, as I talked about, it's still going to be a requirement for all of the land to be purchased and put into reserve status. So a total of now 38,859.33 acres have to be purchased by the trustees and have to be put into reserve status. That's going to take some time. It's not going to happen in a short period of time. You can see how that 38,859.33 is calculated. It's the remaining specific claim acres to be purchased of 94,6515, and then the equity quantum, that 29,394.18. So that's still a requirement. So we're still meeting the mandate of the specific claim trust when it was first established, to make sure the amount of land was purchased and got back into reserve status. Investment provisions, as I said, these are being changed slightly. The biggest change is a requirement for the trustees to retain an investment consultant. And Louis is going to talk about that in his presentation, but the investment consultant is a highly skilled individual who has what they refer to as a chartered financial analyst. It's the highest designation you can get in the investment industry. And this person has to be independent. They just work directly with the trustees. They work for only the trustees. They assist the trustees in going through the investment of the property and making sure that it's done properly. The investment policy is developed properly, and the investment managers are monitored regularly to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. Now, I've seen that work with other communities, and these individuals know what they're doing, and it really helps the trustees in getting the trust property invested properly and getting the most you can get out of the investments. Some of it just kind of blows my mind in what they do and what kind of returns they get and assist the trustees and get it. The investment managers, the actual people who are going to be doing the investment, we changed that definition slightly, okay? So it limits who the trustees can use to actually invest the money, and it's the people that, the large companies that invest billions of dollars, look after pension funds, the people that you want to have looking after your money because they know what they're doing. They're the experts. They monitor the P's and Q's of the investment world, and they know what's going on a daily basis. And then finally, we're suggesting that changes be made to Schedule B, what are authorized investments, and we're suggesting that be changed to a prudent investment standard. It basically just takes away any of the restrictions that the trustees have right now in terms of what they can invest the money in. Of course, it's got to be done prudently. It's got to be done in a proper way. It's got to be done in accordance with an investment policy, and it's got to be done the right way. But they'll be able to do a proper portfolio. That's where you're going to get the difference between that 5% and 7% is by following those steps. The minimum amount, right now the specific claim trust has a requirement that a certain amount has to be maintained at all time, and it can't go below that amount. It's still going to be there, but it's being changed to a set amount, 25 million, as opposed to a formula-driven amount. That formula-driven amount, as it turned out, was difficult to calculate at times. It was difficult for the trustees to monitor, and it kind of hamstringed them a little bit. By putting it at a set amount, then they know exactly what it is, and it won't be hard for them to monitor it and make sure that they're complying with it. But it can never go below that 25 million. There are a couple of exceptions to that, and I'll talk about them, but generally it's got to be 25 million. And then the per capita distributions to the members. So when we were sitting down and talking about it, they said, we want to make a distribution to the members. And they said, well, we can do that using the specific claim trust property, assuming we amend the specific claim trust agreement. So what is being contemplated is 2 distributions. One immediately to the members who are 18 years of age and older as of the date of the ratification vote, so that's November 10th, if it is ratified on that date. Every member who is 18 years or older will get a $2,000 payment. And then the second one is what is referred to as a future distribution. Lawrence would kick me because I call it a minor's distribution, but it's not. It's every member, when they turn 18, will get $2,000. Okay, and that'll just go on in perpetuity. It'll never go away. And every member who turns 18 gets that $2,000. They just come to the band and say, I turned 18, and they'll get a check for $2,000. The First Nation then will get reimbursed through the trust to compensate them for that $2,000. Now, there's been lots of questions about, well, it's $2,000. Is it ever going to change? Well, right now, it's $2,000 unless the chief and council and the trustees decide to change it. They could increase it over time if they wanted, but unless they do, it'll remain at $2,000, okay? Section 8 just deals with operation of the accounts, and that section was really useless and is just being removed. It was unnecessary. It didn't serve any purpose. The income tax rules are being changed. Like we're still, the mechanism, we have to avoid income tax because trusts are taxable, and Louis is going to talk more about this. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail. We just changed the way we're doing it to make sure that there's no income taxes paid. We're really streamlining the approach, but the goal remains to never pay any income tax, okay? At least Canadian income tax. Depending on where the money gets invested, it may be in the United States or in Europe or wherever. There may be other taxes that are paid, but there's ways to get around that as well. But we're focusing on Canadian income tax here, and I said Louis is going to talk about that in more detail. The trustees, so the rules of how you become a trustee, who can be a trustee, how you become a trustee, all that is remaining the same. We're not changing anything. You still got to go through that selection committee. That's going to be established, and they make their recommendation to the council, and the council accepts those recommendations, and it goes on when, it'll just continue that way. The only change that we're making is the bonding requirement. There was a requirement in the specific claim, or there is a requirement in the current specific claim trust agreement that trustees would be required to obtain bonding if the council asked them to get that, made it a requirement. Well, that's never happened. The council has never asked trustees to obtain bonding, and largely because bonding for Indians residing on a reserve is almost impossible to get. And even if you could get it, it's prohibitively expensive. So it was a useless provision, and there's been no issues. Anyways, over the 20 years, there's been no problems. The trustees have done what they're supposed to be doing. There's been no allegations of any wrongdoing. There's been no wrongdoings as far as I know, so no issues there. I haven't heard, yes. And then the powers and duties, I mean, I'll go through them briefly, but these sections really, they haven't changed. They've just been kind of updated to more current standards, but remain largely the same. As I said, the member resolution section, Article 15, is just removed. There's no longer a need anywhere for members' resolutions because of the removal of the ability to make requests for specific claim developments. Conflict of interest, there's still conflict of interest rules in the agreement or will be in the agreement, and more onerous than what's in the current specific claim trust agreement. So, you know, it's from your point of view, it's better. We added a new section dealing with duties of council, section 16, and the intent of this is just say to council members, a new chief, here's your black and white. This is your responsibilities. You don't have to go through the whole trust agreement. It's set out in this one section. You can just look at it and say, this is what you have to do as a council to administer the trust agreement. And then directions, you know, as part of the specific claim trust agreement, there are a number of schedules at the end. They're called directions. These are forms that the trustees sign in order to direct the institution to disperse money out of the trust account. Those are still going to remain. They're changed because they will be changed to comply with the amendments, but there's still a requirement that these directions have to be given to the institution before any money can be taken out of the trust account, and that way the institution makes sure that they're in control of the funds and that the trustees aren't spending them inappropriately and are not in accordance with the terms of the trust agreement. So when you guys were talking about the specific claim settlement agreement, this slide would have been up at the information meeting. Louis and my sister Lasha, who is here presenting, would have shown you the slide and went through it. And this is how your current specific claim trust operates and how the money can be used under the current trust agreement. You know, there's the three accounts: the trust account, the authorized expense account for paying authorized expenses, and then what was referred to as a band account, specific claim band account. That was the tax dodge. That was the account that was included in the agreement to deal with the income tax issues. So if you look at that, the things that are left under the current agreement is purchasing land and then the specific claim development request, and of course paying authorized expenses and investing. This is what it'll look like now. You know, it's different. It may look the same, but it's different. So you've got the trust account, you've got the authorized expense account, so you still have those same two trust accounts, but you now have a revenue account instead of a band account, the legacy revenue account. Each one of you have the trust property there, the specific claim trust property, and the entitlement monies. And then you have the minimum amount that has to be maintained of there of $25 million, so it can't go below that. You have each one of those boxes is below that. Here, below that addresses the different uses that can be made. And if you look to section 4.2 of the trust agreement, this just mirrors that. Okay, so 4.2A is the transfer to the First Nation. $5,142,500. So the $5 million we talked about, the $142,500. You remember that number I talked about earlier? Those were those additional costs that were part of the entitlement monies. So when Mistawasis was going through the negotiations with Canada, they said to Canada, we need some more money to get through this process. And Canada agreed to pay $142,500. But as I understand it, they wouldn't pay it directly to Mistawasis. They said, we'll pay it as part of the entitlement monies, and it's going to go into the trust account with the other monies. Well, that doesn't help Mistawasis right now. They need the money. So they're paying for it, and then they'll be reimbursed for that $142,500 at the end of the process. So I just wanted to point that out to you, okay? The other 5 million will be used to make the distribution to the adult members of the 2,000. That'll come somewhere around, they estimated 4.5 million, maybe a little less, but somewhere around there. Whatever's left over out of that 5 million can be used by the First Nation for band development. So if it's 500,000 or 700,000 or whatever it is at the end of the day after the distribution has been made, then they can use that for band development. Purchasing land, you know, that'll obviously be important. The 38,859.33 acres. Then the future distributions to those members who are turning 18. The full acres, by the way, the purchasing land is set out in Article 6. It's still the same article number. Future distributions, you look to Article 5 of the agreement. Authorized expenses, money can go into this authorized expense account. The rules are set out in Article 10, but it's the same process. There's a budgeting process, has to go to the council approves the budget, and then money goes in accordance with that budget into the authorized expense account, and then the trustees use that. You know, that's where they can write a check, but that's how we control how much money they can spend, because there's only so much money that goes into that account that they have the right to pay for their expenses. Investing, of course, and the rules are set out in Article 7, and then the payment, that annual payment to the First Nation, and those are set out in Article 9 and in Section 8.3. That money goes into the revenue account. Once that annual payment goes, you know, into the revenue account, and also with the transfer to the First Nation of that 5,142,500, once it's paid to the First Nation, the trustee's responsibility ends. So how that money is spent is not the trustee's responsibility. It is the First Nation, the Chief and Council's responsibility. Okay? So don't look to the First Nation or to the trustees to say, how was that annual payment each year spent? They have no responsibility for how that money is spent. Look to the Chief and Council for that. Okay? Their responsibility ends once the money is transferred out of the trust account and into the revenue account. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly run through the sections. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because then it just becomes too repetitive. But Section 1 deals with definitions, and there's 69 defined terms. When you're reading through the trust agreement, if you see a term that's capitalized, that means it's a defined term. Look to this, back to this section to see how that term is defined, okay? Because it can make a difference in how you read something, okay? And there's a bunch of them, and I'm not going to go through them with you. We talked about some of these already, and you can read them for yourself. Schedules, there's 7 schedules, part of the trust agreement. So we still have the trustee's undertaking. That's the undertaking that if you want to be a trustee, you got to sign it. If you refuse to sign it, you can't be a trustee. Everybody's got to sign this to be a trustee. Same undertaking, just change of names in terms of the name of the trust agreement. Authorized investments, Schedule B. We still have the Schedule B, but we've amended it to allow for investments in accordance with prudent investment standard, and that is the only change in that schedule. Then the directions, Schedule C, D, E, F, and G. There's the different directions to be signed for the different uses of the funds that the trustees have to sign and give to the institution in order for money to be transferred out of the trust account. Part 1 is the arrangement between the First Nation and the trustees, and Section 3 just is dealing with the legalese to get the trust established. Article 4 is the important article in the agreement, because this is how the money can be used and how the money can't be used, okay? So 4.2, we already gone through that, each one of those boxes. First, the transfer to the First Nation, the future distributions, the purchasing of land, the investments, annual payment, and then authorized expenses. And each one of those uses has its own separate article that you'd look to see what the rules are specifically for using the money for that purpose. So purchasing land, look to Article 6. What are the rules? Authorized expense account in 4.3, money can go into there, and once it goes into there, then it can only be used to pay for authorized expenses. It can be invested if they want, but generally just paying for authorized expenses. 4.2 says what it can't be used for. So the trust property can't be used to make any further per capita distributions except for those two that we talked about. They can't lend the money. They can't release the money. They can't advance it in any other way. They can't allow it to be used for security for a loan. The First Nation can't come and say, hey, look, we want to go borrow $10 million from the bank, and we want you to they can't do that. Okay, the trustees have no ability to do that. Pardon? No loan sharks. No loan sharks. No. Yeah, that's not allowed. And as I said, once the money is dispersed by the trustees to the First Nation, 4.2 A, B, and E of the agreement, then their responsibility ends, and it's the First Nation, the council's responsibility. Article 5 deals with those initial transfers to the First Nation, that $5,142,500, and for the reimbursement for the future distributions. Article 6 sets out the rules for purchasing and use of the land, and when you go through it, and our former trustee here, when he goes through it, he will see the rules are almost identical. There's been no changes, okay? The only big change is that you can't use the entitlement, you can't do anything with the money until you purchase the shortfall acres and get them into reserve status, other than purchasing those shortfall acres. Now, as I said, you've already purchased 4,606 acres, okay? Roger was putting those into reserve status under the specific claim settlement agreement. And he said, well, Roger, why don't we maybe change that and put them under the TLE settlement agreement, and you'll hit your shortfall acres right away. So that's what's happening. Roger pulled back the request to put those into reserve status under the specific claim agreement, and then once this is ratified, then he'll make the request to put them in to reserve status under the TLE settlement agreement. You'll hit your shortfall acres almost immediately. In fact, you'll hit a record. You'll be the quickest entitlement band in Saskatchewan to do that, I'm sure. And then it kind of opens things up for the community in terms of what they can do with the money. It's still controlled by the trust agreement, but the one advantage to that, though, is those acres that have been purchased, not all of them, I'm sure, or maybe none of them include mineral rights. And any of the mineral rights that are owned by the province or by the federal government, in fact, and are undisposed, and likely most of them would be in your area, they're going to come for free. You're going to get them for nothing. And I know Roger's mentioned that he's made requests of the province before to purchase mineral rights that they own as part of the specific claim process, and they want lots of money for them. I think he mentioned a figure of $1,000 an acre. It's almost the same amount of money, and so it's a lot of money. You're going to get that. That's going to come free for you, for whatever of those mineral rights are undisposed. So that's a big advantage. Okay. So it's still the requirement for a recommendation. The trustees are in control. They start the process. They make a recommendation. The one difference here is that as part of that recommendation, they will then say to the council, we think this land should go into reserve status under the TLE settlement agreement or under the specific claim settlement agreement. Okay, so that decision will have to be made, and then they'll follow through with that. Now, there are certain advantages of going one way or the other, okay, depending on the situation. And they'll have to be analyzed for each time they purchase land. But generally, if you're going to buy land, urban land or rural land, farmland, you're going to want to do it under the TLE agreement because there's benefits to you, such as no paying tax loss compensation, because that's paid by through the fund that David talked about, through the TLE settlement agreement. Specific claim, if you're going to buy urban land, there's a big advantage to using those acres for urban land because you don't have to pay taxes to the school division. All you have to do is enter into your service agreement with the city or municipality. You don't have to worry about the school division. Under the TLE, you have to compensate the school for their tax loss if you want to get urban land, and that can cost lots of money. It can be hundreds of thousands of dollars, so that you just save that money, okay? So those things will have to go forward. I know Roger's working with the ISC and the province, and they're documenting the differences between the two processes so that he's familiar with that. They're still responsible for looking after the land once they buy it, leasing it out, collecting the rent. That rent money goes back into the trust account, and they're still responsible to make sure the land gets into reserve status. And then once it gets into the reserve status, then it becomes part of the First Nation responsibility under the land code, okay? So until reserve status, trustees' responsibility. After reserve status, First Nation responsibility, okay? And then the First Nation collects the rent, and it comes back into the First Nation through the land code provisions. Investment, Article 7, as I said, sets out the rules, and we've talked about that already. That needs to be followed. Annual income, this is the taxation issue. This is how we're dealing with the taxes, and I said Louis is going to talk more about how we're getting about that in Section 75(2) of the Income Tax Act. Annual payment, this section sets out the rules that the trustees have to follow and the institution in getting the annual payment out to the First Nation and making all the calculations and whatnot. The one section I will highlight for you is 9.5. It's on the bottom there. This is new. This is added in. When the First Nation gets the money, each year they have to prepare a statement of receipt and uses of funds that they received. So in 2023, we received $750,000, and we spent it this way, A, B, C, D, okay? They have to then provide that to the members. It has to be presented to the members. It has to be posted in the Mistawasis web page, and any member can get a copy of that on request. Now, that's not audited, but it will become audited as part of the First Nation audit because it's in accordance with the financial administration law. It's in a First Nation account, so it will in the end up being audited, but this statement that they provide doesn't have to be audited. Authorized expenses, we talked about Section 10, the requirement for the budget and then the approval of the budget. The one thing we did here, though, is we put in a limit of 1.5% of the market value from the previous December. So they can't just take whatever they want out of for expenses. They're limited to 1.5%, okay? There are a couple exceptions to that, or not a couple, there's one, except in ordinary circumstances. And the one thing that we were thinking about there is if the trustees were ever sued or they were required to take a court action against somebody and they had to pay a lawyer, well, you're not going to budget for that. That becomes something that's extraordinary, and then they could get more funds over and above that 1.5% if they needed to. The money, and this is one of the exceptions to the minimum amount. You got to operate, you're still going to have the expenses. They can continue to take money for paying authorized expenses, even if it would mean that I would go below that minimum amount. And then we talked about these rules. Trustees, Article 11, as I said, it's the same. There's still 5 trustees, and the requirements are all the same. You still have to have a majority on reserve. You have to meet certain criteria, and you go through that selection process. The thing, as I said, we're changing the terms. Right now, the terms end in the fall, or in the spring. They're going to change to the fall, okay? And Louis and Anita will be for 3 years, starting, and then Lawrence, George Russell, and Robert will be for 2 years. And then the process will just continue on with the new selection. And then after that is 3 years.
Who makes the selection again?
It's a committee that's set up by the Chief and Council, an independent committee. And Price Waterhouse. They're still using Price Waterhouse, yeah. So it's been the same from the beginning, yeah. Article 12 just sets out the trustees' powers, things they need to do to perform their duties, to give them all the powers they need to do. 13, the trustees' duties, just sets out some specific duties. Obviously, they got to comply with the trust agreement, but you know they have they have to do accounting and reporting, and you know there's still the same things that they have to do under the current trust agreement. None of that's being changed. The only thing that is being changed is this annual report. They still got to do an annual report, but there is a requirement right now in the specific claim trust agreement for that annual report to be mailed out. And as it turned out, when they mailed it out, it was kind of useless. Most of them came back. And it was finding that it was of just an expense that they were going through that was a useless expense. So it's being changed that they still have to post it in the administrative office. They still have to post it. Now they have to post it on the First Nations webpage. And any member that wants a copy, you just phone and say, I want a copy, and they'll send it to you, okay? So you have every right to see it. And just like with the specific claim trust, you want to see all the records, you have every right to go. You just have to phone up the trustees or Roger and say, I want to come in, I want to go through the records, and you have every right to go, and they'll set it up for you. You know, they'll go through it with you, and you have all the ability to see all the records that you want to see. And bringing an auditor with you. If you want to pay for that auditor, you go right ahead. It's sure. I'm not kidding. If you want to have an expert come with you, then you can do that. Yeah, and they can't refuse. Article 14 deals with the trustees' meetings. Nothing's changed here. It just sets out some general governing provisions for their meetings and how decisions are made. As we talked about, Article 15, conflict of interest, and Article 16 is the duties of council. This is that new section added in to address and set out what the council's duties are. Part 2 is the banking arrangement with the institution, opening accounts, and the rules that the institution has to follow or make sure the trustees follow before money can be released from the trust account. And they'll be also responsible to make sure that minimum amount is maintained. And they'll make sure it's there, because if they don't, they become responsible for the shortfall, and they're not going to do that. It just sets out the documents that have to be provided to the institution in order to get the money out of the trust account, whether it's council resolutions or budgets or certificates or agreements, investment management agreements, or these directions. It just provides for all those rules that have to be provided in order to get the money out. And then the last part of it is further assurances. The biggest one here is the amendments, okay? You can still amend it. The rules really haven't changed in terms of amending, just the section numbers have changed. So 21 or 22.1 is almost exactly the same as section 23.01 of the current agreement. It's just a different section number. The trustees and the council have the right to amend the agreement without member approval to avoid any negative tax consequences. You don't want to pay anything. Louis is going to come up here and he's going to talk about the bad things about income tax. 47.5%, it's a big ouch, and you don't want to be paying that in taxes. So if the rules change, laws change, and therefore the trust agreement has to change, then they can do that immediately. 22.2 also allows the trustees and the council to amend the trust agreement to change, if there's been changes in the law or there's some kind of defect in the trust agreement that now needs to be changed to make it more efficient or to improve it, they can do that without member approval. Any other changes, like we're doing right now, in amending the specific claim trust, have to have member approval. There's got to be a ratification vote. So that's the only way to make major changes to the agreement other than those two sections that I talked about. And then there's notice provisions, and then there's some other general provisions, and then there's the schedules where we already talked about, and that's it for me. That's my contact information. If you want, write it down. You have a question, I'm obligated to answer any questions you have until the ratification vote date next week. And I'm happy to do it. I've already been getting emails and texts from some members with some questions, and I'm available to you at any time that you have a question and you want to ask. I'll be happy to answer it for you. And I think Louis is going to come up and he's going to go through his presentation, and then we can take questions on the trust agreement after Louis is done. Is that right, Roger? Okay.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. There it is. Membership? Tony. Tony is a membership clerk. Okay, so Debbie's getting Tony to come over here, so she'll, you can ask her the question then. Yeah, please.
Hello. Hi, Tony. Sorry to bug you.
Okay.
Yeah, but before I forget, I had just a question. I don't know if the lawyers or you or Roger or the chief counsel, but I have a grandson, and I think you're aware of one of them already. Two of them are treaty now, but I had another one. The mom's from Mistawasis, and the father, we still can't contact the father. So when this agreement goes through after it's signed, can I still bring him on board after he's treaty? Does he still qualify for the benefits that any other 18-year-old? Because if it's an ongoing legacy thing, is he entitled to that?
Oh, you have another grandson that needs to be registered?
Yes, and we're still in the process of finding the father.
Okay.
He's treaty, but then I don't know even who he is, but the daughter knows. But then that's what we're working on.
Well, I think there's no deadline.
How old is your grandson?
He's 8.
If he becomes a member before he's 18,
Yeah. Yeah, that's the question I had, yeah. So, and I think a lot of people will have the same questions probably before this thing is over. Like tomorrow, maybe tomorrow I'll bring it up again just for a reminder, because some people ask what they don't want to ask. They're too scared or too shy to ask. And I think there's some of these questions a lot of people, they like to know, then they find out that they feel better when they have their answer. So that was what I had.
it
So,
doesn't matter when the minor member became a member.
yeah.
They just have to become a member before they're 18.
Before they're 18. Yeah, because his mom is from Mistawasis and the father, we just can't locate him right now. Yeah, so that's what we're in the process of doing that. Yeah, so, okay, thanks, Tony.
Okay.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. So now Louis will take over. Pardon? Oh, the question was, if anybody, whether they're, as long as they're a band member before they turn 18, then on their 18th birthday, they are entitled to the $2,000. Okay, Louis?
Thank you, Roger. Good evening, elders, band members. The chief has left, but council and veterans at this time of the year. My name is Louis Tapper. I'm a chartered professional accountant, and I've worked with your nation for several years now. What's being proposed is the amendment of the specific claim trust, and I'm happy to say that in 2001, I came to the members and we talked about the ratification of the specific claim settlement. And some of the meetings, I don't know if you remember or you were there, they were very heated, very stressful times. And some of the members said, oh, the money's going to disappear, it's going to evaporate, chief and council is going to take it. So we tried to say, no, it's going to be safe. And I'm very proud to say today and happy, and I give the trustees credit, the trust funds have grown to 14.6. I think they started with about 12 million, and now it's 14.6. And which is going to remain in the trust, and on top of that, they bought 12,000 acres, and some is in reserve status. 4,606 is still in fee simple, and it will be contributed. So how much is that land worth today? Well, if you listen to what David said, the TLE was based on about $1,000 an acre, so that would be about $12 million that land would probably be worth, or something like that. So the trustees have done their job. The trust agreement did work. Could we have done better? Yes. Could we have done worse? Yes. So overall, I think it showed good results. And as Stephen said, even though there were several changes, the structure is basically the same. The details are basically the same, except there's some improvements, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So the settlement monies, or the entitlement monies of $30 million is going to be contributed to the trust and the specific claim trust. To emphasize, there is going to be only one trust. There's only one trust now. It's called the Legacy Trust, if you ratify the agreement. Purpose of this document or my presentation, I'm going to talk about the safe custody, the preservation of capital, the management of the trust property, the investment, and that's a very important part of the trust agreement, in my estimation, is the investment of the trust property, distributions and use of the trust property. What is it going to be used for? Financial issues. We'll talk about the rates of return and the risks to get those rates of return. And as Stephen said, I'm going to talk about income taxes, and hopefully it won't be too technical. The safe custody of trust property, and again, the specific claim trust assets are going to go in there into a trust account, which is deposited into a trust account for the institution. And an institution is basically a trust company, or they're authorized to carry on business in Saskatchewan. And Royal Trust has been identified as the trust company. The institution, and this is important to emphasize, and Stephen talked about Royal Trust being a gatekeeper, a safety check. They will only allow the transfer of funds if it's in accordance with the trust agreement. And I've worked with Peace Hills Trust, I've worked with Royal Trust, lots of the financial institution, and they're very, very, very particular, and they're very, very cautious because they don't want to be sued if they don't follow the rules and do their proper job. And Royal Trust, they definitely do have the experience. They manage several trusts across Canada. Preservation of capital, and this is an important topic, because how do we make sure that capital is going to be around as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the river flows? Because it's important, it's a legacy trust to be around. So to emphasize or to state that once deposited in the trust account, the entitlement monies, it's no longer considered Indian monies, and it's not governed by the Indian Act. Canada has no responsibility. That's the same with the Mistawasis Specific Claim Trust. It's not Indian monies, nor is it governed by the Indian Act. It's governed by the trust agreement. And the trust agreement, jokingly, I compare it sometimes to the Bible because it really tells you what you can do. One of the main areas, and that's why I said it's so important, is the authorized investments and how you invest your money, and that could seriously erode the capital. And again, to help prevent that, the trustees, with the assistance of the investment consultant, they have to develop an investment policy, and I'll talk more about an investment policy, but it really determines the types of investment the trustees can purchase. So generally speaking, they can't invest in too risky, and it'll say the quality and quantity, and I'll talk more about that. And the investment consultant has to be a chartered financial analyst, and that's one of the top financial investment designations you can get, and it's recognized right across the world. And sometimes they refer to it as a CFA, but it's a very difficult course to pass, and very bright people do that. And those people have to be independent of Mistawasis and the trustees and the investment managers. And the investment consultant cannot sell investments, because if he's evaluating or doing stuff with the investment manager, he can't sell investments, because how can he evaluate himself? So it's totally independent. And Stephen talked about independence rules, and accountants, lawyers, we take our independence very, we're concerned about it. We have to follow rules. I have a big rule book that's this defines what independence is, and we have to follow it, or our institution will take us to task. The Legacy Trust Agreement requires the investment consultant to have really the good experience and qualifications. The trustees interview them and make sure that they are appropriate. So until, and Stephen talked about it a little bit, the investment policy is developed, you have to follow Part 1 of Schedule B, and those investments are very safe investments. They're like GICs, they're like bonds, like Government of Canada bonds, corporate bonds, and very secure, safe companies. But unfortunately, there's a very low rate of return. So you don't take a lot of risk, but you don't get a lot of return. So once that's been done, the investment consultant will help the trustees select an investment managers, and they also are independent. They have to be independent of the investment consultant, the trustees, independent of the institution. So that's very important. Independence is very important because it kind of keeps you honest. Yeah, fair enough. But it does really, if you have to follow independent, and thank you for that. But, when I say kind of, every accountant, every lawyer, we're not all created equal. There's some really, really good people and some not good people. So that's why we do a very strenuous selection process where we interview people and make sure kind of is not involved. Thank you for the humor. I hope it was humor. So George and Bell Consulting has been identified to be the investment consultant, and as I understand, the trustees interviewed 3 different investment consultant firms, and they picked the one that they thought was the best. And by the way, CFAs has standards on independence too that they have to follow. To preserve capital, there's also a minimum of $25 million as a minimum amount, and the institution will not allow the transfer of trust property other than for the payment of authorized expenses or to make sure you're not being taxable. So they could pay an extra amount to the nation so that you're not taxable. And that $25 million is based on the cost, basically the book value. Preservation of capital continued. Council can amend the trust agreement for taxation and changes in laws or defects, as Stephen talked about. It also can make amendment with written agreement provided ratification of the terms. So there has to be ratification of the vote. So there has to be a clear majority of the eligible voters in the case of other provisions. So there is a voting requirement like we're doing today. And also the trust agreement will allow the payment of other items, and we'll talk about that later on distributions and use. So those will erode the capital as well. The management of the trust has to be in accordance with the legacy trust agreement. It has to be, and you have the watchdog, the financial institution, the institution that will make sure that is done, as well as your trustees, because they're selected by an independent selection committee. And in my experience, or from what I know about the trust, it seems to have worked. They've always gotten strong trustees right from the very beginning. So it's a very important committee to select the right trustees, and they have to have the skills, the experience, and the qualification. There's also several, and Stephen talked about it, several areas, articles in the trust agreement that details what the duties and responsibilities of the trustees are. Also, Royal Trust, again, they have to assist the trustees in fulfilling their duty. Council also has a role. They have to help with the purchase of the land. They have to assist in reserve creation. They have to work with the trustees to develop an investment policy, and they have to review financial statements, and they have to approve operating expenditures of the trustees, and that's Article 16. Yes?
Who does the selection of the independent committee?
So basically that's done by chief and council. The selection of the independent committee is done by council, and they have to be independent. In the past years, they've used a professional accounting firm, Price Waterhouse, to assist with the selection. And they require certain information about the trustees, which is in one of the articles that details what is required. It's a very onerous job. Okay? No, thank you. So, and Chief and Council have other responsibilities, Article 16, and we'll talk about some of the other ones. For example, they do have to disclose what they've done with the money they receive on the annual payment. On an annual basis, they were required to engage the services of an independent auditor to audit the financial statements. So they have to hire an auditor to audit the financial statements. And please know that the trustees really, all you're really auditing is the trustee, mostly the trustees' expenses. Really, with the other part of the trust agreement, if it comes out of the capital, Royal Trust, the institution has to be involved, but we also, the auditor will also audit those. So it's a very stringent process in the auditing. So above all, the trust agreement really requires you to hire the best of the best. And you do a recruiting and interview process to make sure. Also, the trust agreement is designed to manage the trust property or the trust effectively and make sure there is transparency and accountability. The trustees have to come to the members, report their results. You have to get an audit. Chief and Council has to do a report on how they spent the money they received. So there is the transparency and accountability as best as you can have it. And I think that it has been working so far. There's always been accountability and transparency. Management continued. The trust agreement, while similar to the specific claim trust, it's basically the same with some improvement. It really did serve its purposes since 2001. Like I said, the money's intact. They bought lots of land. They've done $1 million in land development. And both agreements, they really are designed for the safe custody, preservation of capital, prudent investment, and the efficient management of the trust. And the Legacy Trust is designed to ensure the safe custody. They're both designed to do that. And the specific claim trust or the Legacy Trust are very similar. In addition, management have been made. So the trust agreement, as Stephen said, improvements have been made for the investment of the trust property, a prudent investor, and it's basically what a prudent investor does. And in the Trustees Act of Saskatchewan, there's a detailed section on what is considered to be a prudent investment. And you consider things like economic condition, taxation, future cash flows of the trust, and various other things. The differences and similarities, Stephen touched on that, and he went through in great detail on that. So I'm not going to do that as well. As in the specific claim trust, on the land that's purchased until it's into reserve status, it is basically the income goes back into the trust, and their plan is to use it to purchase land. Once it's reserve status, it's the nation's responsibility. So when it's fee simple, it's the trustees. When it's reserve status, it's the First Nations responsibility. And by the way, they should report that in their annual audit, what revenues they generate from the land. And again, under both, there has to be a budget approved by council. So the investment and appropriate investments, just to repeat myself quickly, investments which a reasonable, prudent investor would invest, we have to use the investment consultant, and it's important, and I'm emphasizing the point, they have the investment consultant, which are these top-notch investment people. They're independent of the nation. They assist with the development of the investment policy. And your investment policy really, it's kind of a rule book. It details lots of information that the trustee or the investment managers have to follow. Assist with the selection of investment managers. And yes?
Is there only certain investments that the trust fund can access?
And partly what you do, that's the purpose of the investment policy statement. It will set out what investments you can invest in. Generally, and you have to follow the prudent investor, what a prudent or a smart investor would invest in, and the quantity. So you wouldn't buy 100% of equities in, let's say, Toronto Dominion Bank. You would restrict how much you could invest in Toronto Dominion Bank or Royal Bank or any investment. So it'll detail what the quality and quantity of the investments are. It's a roadmap.
Yes, but if you're looking at investors, is there some investors that do not fall in this category, for instance, the international ones?
Nope. If that's in your investment policy to invest it, and in fact, I would think, and I'm not an expert in this area, that a prudent investor would want to invest internationally. They would want to invest in the emerging markets as well, so that they have a diversified portfolio.
Yeah, okay. I guess I just misunderstood some of the documents, because according to what I understand in reviewing those documents, is there's some investors that they're not eligible to access.
And that is definitely the truth. So generally speaking, and again, I'm not my area, but from my experience and generally speaking, I don't think you would want to invest in a company that is privately owned, because how do you get out of that company? So there will...
Excuse me, but I hear what you're saying, but my question is there some investors that do not qualify under this agreement for them to access to invest?
No,
Or
The answer
can
is
they
they have to-
invest in any category?
answer.
Okay, then I misread the information in the package then.
The current, thank you.
The current specific claim trust agreements does have some restrictions in Part B. The proposed amendments, there'll be no restrictions in terms of what they can invest in.
Providing that this becomes providing it falls under one legacy trust, is that correct?
Well, that's the amendments. So if the amendments are accepted, the Schedule B then will be amended in accordance with the amendment terms, And that won't restrict them in any way in what they can invest in. They will put their own restrictions on themselves.
And they are?
The trustees. And the consultant and the council, because the council has to approve the investment policy as well. Okay?
And really, one of them, if you want to call it a restriction, it's what a prudent investor would be, because that's in the agreement, and you have to follow those rules, what a prudent investor. So my estimation, it's a well-diversified portfolio, and they look at several factors. And they also, the investment consultant will evaluate that investment managers, and that's why they have to be independent. Stephen talked about the payment of $5,142,000. Last night at a membership meeting, a member said, well, there's 2,100 members or so. It doesn't quite add up to 4.5, but Stephen explained that there will be other costs, so it will be more or less $4.5 million that will be needed for per capita payment and for the administration of those payments.
What would those other costs entail?
Banking charges, setting up basically administration. And those are covered in Articles 4 and 5 of the trust agreement. Also, Stephen talked about the 2,000 to members who turn 18, and that's covered in 4 and 5, and it's 2,000 unless Chief and Council says, well, and the trustees say we need to change that amount. So because of inflation, or the trust has done really well with their investing. And of course, purchase of land, they have to purchase the number of acres in specific claim. They have to purchase 9,400 acres, 9,465, and the equity quantum, 29,394.
I have one other question. How does this ratio affect the economy given the pandemic?
The ratio, sorry?
Yeah, the way you figured the dollar amount up. How does this,
Like the 2,000?
no, in any amount, because of the economy?
Well,
Say that the trustees have the ability to change that amount to whatever amount they deem reasonable,
yes.
but how does that figure in based on the economy the way it is, considering the pandemic issue?
Well, what I think they would probably do is they would go to an accountant or somebody in their band office and says, okay, will you do a calculation on what the impact is inflation's been on in 10 years? And so there are statistics that are published for inflation.
Only if a trustee brings up that issue.
Or a member, somebody because there's going to be a membership, so meeting, and if a person's turning 18, if they say to the Chief and Council, we don't think that's fair, will you evaluate it? Because my experience as Chief and Council, they generally listen to the members, generally speaking.
It's agreement of the trustees and the council.
Yep, it's agreement. But who do you raise the issue with? Either the trustees or Chief and Council, or both. Yep.
Just a quick question. Not that I'm getting old, I'm forgetful.
Me too.
When they made the trust payment, Roger, when they first come out and pay the 18-year-olds, they weren't old enough, then they were old enough, they got their money. Where did that interest on that money go? And do they get it?
Okay, and back in 2001 you're talking about? Okay, in 2001 there was a miners trust account set up. So everyone that was on the band list as of July 16, 2001, $1,000 was set aside. If they're a minor, that was set up with Peace Hills Trust, and as they turned 18, the interest was calculated, and then so, I'll give you an example. The last payments that were made July 2019, the $1,000 was worth roughly $1,900. So that interest that was calculated was added to that $1,000 for those miners. Yes, they got it. Yeah.
But in this scenario, that's not happening.
No, that's correct. That's correct. So that's why I'm sure the members are going to raise it with Chief and Council that you need to revisit on a regular basis on what is fair. So, and part of the reason why leaving it in the trust was discussed was the trustees and trustees and Chief and Council says the amount they earned on the miners' trust was very minimal. It wasn't very much because in 18 years or whatever, you made basically $900, which is really not very much. You could get a better rate of return by leaving it in the trust. So that's why I think the members will go to Chief and Council and the trustees to say, okay, we need to revisit that. Or that's what I would do if I was a member turning 18. Okay? And thank you for your questions. So the goal is to convert all the land into reserve status, and that's covered in Articles 4 and 6. And the investment of the trust property, again, that's Schedule B and developing the investment policy. The investment policy is a really important document, and it's crucial to develop that. Otherwise, you're in the less risky, less return investments. Articles 4 and 7 of the trust agreement. Annual payment, and these are transferred into the revenue account, which is controlled by the First Nation, Mistawasis, through its financial laws and policy. I don't know if you're aware of it. Your nation applied to the Financial Management Board, First Nation Financial Authority, to receive loan funding, and they had to develop their own financial laws and policies, and it's very stringent. It's a big, thick document, and it really lays out the policies and the rules. As far as I know, the Financial Management Board hasn't really scrutinized the operations, but they will examine to make sure the nation is following their rules and policy. As I understand, that's their job, but it's really an onerous financial laws and policy, and there has to be accountability. Pardon me. So the annual payment, the purpose of the annual payment is to have a deduction under 104(6) of the Income Tax Act. And generally speaking, when we talk about income tax, we talk about the Income Tax Act. We don't talk about the Indian Act. We don't talk about treaties. Treaties would be well above my head, though I have a pretty good understanding of them because I've been around for many years. And so everything we talk about is the Income Tax Act, because if you're dealing with Canada Revenue Agency, all they are concerned about is with the Income Tax Act. And that said, there are provisions in there about the Indian Act. And that's Articles 4 and 9 of the trust agreement. And that's a payment to the nation. The nation does have to report to you as members what they did with that money. So on an annual basis, also it's included in their audit of their financial statements. But the nation has such big financial statements, big numbers, that the amount of the payment, that $750,000, would get lost within the other amounts. So that's why they have to do a separate schedule of receipts and disbursements. Yes?
What is classified as an extraordinary circumstance?
As Stephen was saying, an extraordinary, if let's say they had to hire a lawyer, they were getting sued, or let's say they had to sue the trust company because they didn't do their job, so they had to hire a lawyer, or if let's say there was a pandemic and they had certain costs that they had to deal with, so costs that they couldn't budget for, they didn't know, and that they could be significant.
So unforeseen circumstances that are beyond the bank's control.
Basically, or the trust control.
Or the trust control.
Yep. And they would be extraordinary. So not in the ordinary course. And again, a lot of those would have to be, the regular budget has to be approved by council, and it's capped at 1.5% of the trust, the fair market value of the trust property. But they could go over that under extraordinary circumstances. So authorized expenses, again, we kind of talked about that. Those are reasonable expenses. They're reasonable expenses. And those are covered under Articles 4 and 10. Financial issues, potential rates of risk, returns and risk. When we did the first settlement in 2001, quite honestly, the members thought, and the trustees and everybody thought, that investing was gambling. Nothing more than gambling if you bought equities, and at first the trustees were very, very conservative, and as they went along and learned, then they got a little more aggressive in buying equities, which are a little bit more risk, but they give you a better return. And how much risk are they? And I always use the example that Toronto-Dominion Bank has been around longer than I have. They're going to be around a lot longer than I'm around. So, and they basically pay 4% dividend each year, and their value increases. So is that really gambling if you buy Toronto-Dominion's bank stocks, or let's say Apple in the US? Apple goes up each year, it seems. It pays a dividend. Other companies too, in the States, like we've all heard of Microsoft, and those are the kinds of investments that the trustees will invest in that give you a better return than 1% or 2% you can get on bonds these days. And that's one thing we've learned over time is be smart about your investments. Don't take too big a risk, but buy good quality investments, and they will do you justice. And I have to say, when we did this in 2008, 2009, there was the financial crisis. We have all heard about that. The stock market dropped 30%. I got phone calls because I'm telling them you have to buy equities. And so they were a little perturbed with me, saying, well, you said equities, how can we go wrong? And I went down and I had to say, just be calm, just relax, they were going to go up. And sure enough, they went up, and you could see how well the trust did. So same with in March 2000, when the pandemic hit, the stocks dropped 30-40%. And don't panic, stay calm. As long as you don't need to cash your money in, it'll come back. And that's what history said. The dirty 30s where the markets crashed, that was another example. And there's been other ones. There was the high-tech bubble in, I don't know, about 1990. So generally speaking, they will come back. So that's what we really learned is don't be too safe, but don't be too risky. So again, steps. Yes.
Should this package be approved and it falls under the legacy trust agreement, does that mean to say that the existing trustees will become trustees of this legacy agreement? And if so, has any consideration been given to that one article you have set out where the trustees are to look at the objectives and frameworks or develop that policy, that investment policy? Has any consideration been given in that matter as to the goals
So,
or the
and
money when that's been set?
Stephen talked earlier about the trustees. I'll let him talk. Give him the mic again.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Louis. We're amending, okay? So it's not a new trust. The specific claim trust continues to exist, but the name is being changed. So because of that, the trustees remain the same, okay? Now they have an investment policy in place now because they were required under the specific claim, but that's going to change because of the involvement based on this. That's right. And they've already had some discussions with the investment consultant that they want to work with George and Bell out of Vancouver, and that process has started, but it's not completed because they got to wait till the ratification, because if it's not ratified, then there's no point moving. It'll change what they do, right?
And Stephen was talking earlier about there's 2 trustees, their term expires basically in 2 years, and you'll have to go through the selection process again. And the investment policy statement should, whether it's annually, but it should be reviewed on a regular basis because circumstances change. You may want to fine-tune your investment policy, adapt to the conditions. So the investment policy is not static. Once you've done it, it's not cast in stone. It can be amended and should be. So the investment policy, as I said, it's approved by council. It really sets out the objectives and the framework for the investments of the trust property. It also addresses matters of performance goals that the investment managers has to follow. So what are investment goals? For example, some of you will have heard of the S&P 500. It's an index. NASDAQ, that's an index. The TSX, that's the Canadian one, and there's one for Europe, and emerging markets and different benchmarks. So you add them all up and you compare how did your investment manager do to those benchmarks. If they underperformed, well, then you put them on notice that you're not doing your job. And you compare them with other people, but generally you want them to perform better than the benchmarks, so that they more than cover their fees. So that's the job of the investment consultant, is to evaluate those managers. Are they doing a good job for you? And they take their job seriously because they're chartered financial analysts and they have rules that they have to follow. And risk tolerance, how risky of an investment do you want to take? And if the investment consultant thinks the trustees are being too aggressive or taking too much risk, they'll say, no, you don't do that. It's too risky. So they're really very important people in making sure you get things right. And it looks at the quantity. They won't let you buy 100% of anything. They'll say you only can invest, let's say, 5% of your trust property in one investment or whatever is decided. And the quality. They won't let you buy, let's say, penny stocks. We've all heard about penny stocks. They probably won't let you buy penny stocks. So the investment consultant, and again, I emphasize this, and Stephen talked about it, the independence. We all have rules on independence, and basically they cannot sell investments and they cannot be any ways associated with the investment managers. The investment consultant, again, plays a really important role in the selection of the investment managers. Every 3 years, they have to evaluate those investment managers, and as Stephen said, George and Bell in Vancouver, some of the nations I work with, I think your trustees were the same. They heard them do a presentation and they say, oh, wow, they're worth the money they're paid, and they think outside the box. So hopefully they will earn their money and get you that a better rate of return. And again, the actual return and risk will depend on the investment policy. And again, that's an important statement. And the world economy, because we're all tied to the world, and the skill of the investment managers. All investment managers aren't created equal. There's some really good ones and not so good ones, and that's why the investment consultant is crucial to help you select the best ones you can. Oh, great, income tax. That's what everybody was waiting for, and hopefully this isn't way too technical, but by its nature it's technical, and there's a few things you just have to know. The first one is, I think we've done a very good job in making sure the trust is not subject to Canadian income tax, which is provincial as well, and as Stephen said, it's 4.75%, so ouch if you get stuck with income tax. So I think we've taken the steps to make sure of that, and as I said, we followed the Income Tax Act. As Stephen talked about, there's foreign tax, withholding tax in the U.S., but you can file for do an election so that it's not withheld. So again, the trust should not be subject to Canadian income tax. For legal purposes, it's a separate legal entity. It's different than the nation. It's different from any business. It's a separate legal entity. And basically, a trust is The settler is the giving of assets. He gives the assets. The settler, in this case, is which the nation, they contributed the assets to the trust, so they're the settler, and they're the beneficiary as well, and you as members, being a member, are also a beneficiary, and the trustees are there to administer the trust property. Pardon me. And for the income tax, a trust is viewed as a separate entity. It's an individual, and it has to file an annual, what we call a T3, a trust informational return, income tax return, and if it's taxable, and Stephen talked about it, 47.5% of taxation. And what we talk about is to prevent taxation, we attribute the income to the settler, the First Nation, and that's an important rule. The income is going to be taxed in the hands of the settler, and you're going to sit there and say, well, how does that do any good if the First Nation is going to be taxed? Well, I'll talk more about that, and the First Nation is not subject to taxation. So the attribution is covered under 75(2) of the Income Tax Act, and it basically says it's going to revert back to the settler of the First Nation. So that's an important section. And by the way, 75(2) came in several years ago, probably 20, 25 years ago. What rich people were doing were setting up trust, and then they would allocate the income out to their children. And their children basically could earn a good chunk of money and pay very little tax, because the person who contributed the money was paying 50% tax or thereabouts. So they said, we're going to allocate it to our children and not pay as much tax. So Canada Revenue Agency said, that's not right. We're going to put in 75(2). We're going to attribute that income back to the rich person. And so a lot of my colleagues were crying because they did all this tax planning to get the income into the children's hands. And Louis was saying, yes, this is perfect for First Nations, because in trust we want to get the income into the hands of the First Nation because they're not subject to taxation. And I'll talk more about that later. However, on the funds that were contributed, any income earned on that's not paid out, they earn income, and that part is taxable. So what we do is that's why we pay the 2% to the First Nation, because that portion is paid out, and that comes from the income that's earned on the income that's not paid to the First Nation. So, and again, the First Nation is not subject to tax. So at 75(2) and 104.6 gets all the taxable income out of the trust into the hands of the First Nation. Now, Mistawasis is exempt from income tax under 149(1)(c) of the income tax, and that's in the income tax which says a public body performing a function of government is not subject to taxation. And the nice thing about it in the several years ago, it wasn't a public body performing a function of government. There was a municipality put in there, and a lot of the nation I work with, they don't like the term municipality. They don't want to be referred to a municipality, because a municipality is subordinate to the province, and the province is subordinate to the Canada, and First Nations say we are a nation. We're not subordinate to Canada. We are a nation, and we need to negotiate nation to nation. That's what I was told. So in summary, just to repeat, and sorry for repeating myself, but the trust should not have any taxable income, and Stephen talked about that. If we have to, we can amend the trust agreement for taxation. If they change the rules on us, we can change the trust agreement. Also, if there is any income in the trust at the end of the day, we can increase the payment to the First Nation to make sure there is no taxation in the trust. So the income is all taxed in the hands of the First Nation, and the First Nation is exempt under 149(1)(c) of the Income Tax Act. And talking about the money, and I did a chart up here that would show the growth of the trust. If we and the plan was to grow it at 1.5%, but if it grew at 2%, that's the top line, you would have 65 million. At 1.5%, at the end of the year, end of the 25 years, you'd have 58 million, and at 1%, it would be 5.1. That's what the trust will grow to in 25 years. In 50 years, you can see the numbers are quite significantly higher. And how did I come up with those numbers? We did, and we discussed this. It wasn't me who came up with this money or these calculations. It was discussions with the trustees, mostly not the trustees, but the committee that was dealing with this, and chief and council, and we said, these are what we want to use. So we said the rate of return was 7%, and that's the average. You're not going to get 7% every year. You might get 5% some years, you might get 12% some years. It'll depend on the year. But we don't have a crystal ball, so we just set an average of 7%. We said authorized expenses 1.5%, payment to the nation is 2%, and the first few years it's 750,000. The trust agreement allows that 2% to go up to 4%, but after the land has been purchased. The land purchases we thought would be $1,000 or $1,000, and that should be per acre. And the price of land increases 5%. And those are all assumptions. And there may be an educated guess if you want, but if any of those assumptions are wrong, my numbers are way out of whack. So if they decide to buy land quicker than what we budgeted, that will throw the numbers off. So we came up with this, and I showed the first 3 years, then 23, 24, and 25. And you can see that if you, the first column, not the years, but the trust investment, at the end of 25 years, it's 57,257,000, but you have to add in the inflation return amount of 858,000, and that's how I came to that 58 million that on the previous slide. And the things I want to point out to you, see the column payment to nation at the bottom. The number is $23,800,000 over 25 years. That's what the nation is going to receive. And as the chief said, it's going to be used for maybe education. So maybe you have more lawyers and accountants and doctors and teachers and other things. Or it could be used for economic development. And if you do some good economic development projects, that will benefit all the members. The amount returned to the trust is 18 million. That grows it from 40 million to start with to the 58 and 25 million. And the other important one is the total land that they're going to buy over 25 years is $30 million. So that's what they're going to invest in the land. Not in here. They're going to get lease revenue on that land once it's in reserve status. That goes to the First Nation, so they will get a significant amount of lease revenue. Maybe they'll use it for land development or economic development if they find some good economic development. So it could be very lucrative to members as we progress over the years. And again, I emphasize, if those assumptions I made at the start aren't right, well, then my numbers are not going to be correct. But the numbers, I think, are reasonable based on what I know. When we talked about contributing 1.5% back, that was basically inflation for inflation. But if we've been following the news, inflation has been much higher. But in our model, it's 1.5 that gets contributed back, assuming we make 7%. If we make 8%, well, then that 1.5 makes it even look better. And just some other assumptions we used. And if you need to call or talk about taxation, I can't imagine anybody want to talk about taxation, but anything else in my presentation or have some questions, that's my contact information. And I thank you very much, and I wish you all the very, very best. And if there's questions, I gladly take them. or anybody here would gladly take them.
When we, investing, the trust is, that trust specifically land, it's gotta be land only?
No, nope, they will invest, that's how they're gonna generate money to buy the land, is through what they make on the investments, as well as the land lease revenue they're gonna generate on it. So the first thing is going to be invest the money, generate the income, and then you'll take some of that income and basically, that's how we're able to grow the trust.
Okay, so investments would be GICs and
They could be some GICs. I hope not too many GICs.
Bitcoin?
Chances are, and again, I'm not an investment consultant, but I don't know if that would fall under a prudent investor. And because you've got people like Jamie Dimon from not Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, who says Bitcoin is you're going to lose all your money. So when they talk about that, even like Tesla, is that what you would invest in? So those are what you need the investment consultant to say, you don't want to invest in that, or if you do invest in it, it's just a little piece of the pie. So, okay, thank you. Good, thank you.
When this goes through after November 10th, and you said down the road we'll be working with the cows and that, and that's when you guys will go after it, or?
The cows and plows? I'm going to defer that to either Stephen or Roger. The chief's not here, but
I'm working on two other claims with the First Nation, the cows and plows and a trust account mismanagement claim. And it's not the trust account we're talking about, it's the accounts that Canada, the revenue account and the capital account. And I know there's another claim that they're working on, but I'm not involved in that. That's the CP claim. Yeah. They'll have to be, yeah. They'll have to be. Yeah. I mean, Canada has their thresholds, that they go, so if it's, because they're all specific claims, and depending on what process it goes under, but if a claim is under 5 million, they just pay it to the First Nation on a... Well, that's the intent, yeah. The chief can answer that better, but that's been the discussion. That has been the discussion, yes, yeah.
Regards to that cows and plows, that's 100% membership, goes to membership.
It may be.
Does it go to chief and council? No, it does.
Well, that will be up to the community to make a decision on. But Canada will not put any restrictions like this TLE. There are restrictions from Canada in how that money can be used. But a settlement like that, it's totally in your guys' hands. Yeah.
So when this goes through, like my grandson say, once 4 years old, so when he turns 18, by then we'll be done as cows and plows and all these things will all be done, right? Should we?
Yeah, that's the hope. That's right. I mean, those things can be decided when the time comes. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. I mean, you want to put some into this, fine. You want to pay it out, fine. I mean, that's up to you guys. Yeah, you'll make those decisions.
Any last answer anything, or?
I like the payment they got on.
I think it's okay.
Yeah, of course, everybody likes more, right? Yes, of course. I know there's been some big precedents out there right now, and everybody's hearing this stuff, but this kind of a settlement, yeah.
As I see it, you have so many claims and settlements. I hope that I may have to live to be 1,000 years old. So, anyways, I wish you all the very, very best and good luck, and we're at the reserve tomorrow. So, Ekose.
Thank you, Louis. And thank you for all the questions tonight. And if there's no other questions, then we will wrap up for the evening. And I'll ask Elder to say our closing prayer.
Well, thank the Creator for another day. I hope that everything works out for everybody and everybody can try and get along and be friends in the world. And we'll all have a safe journey home